So we're going to talk about some different contaminants in the composting process, and also talk about bioplastics, and just kind of talk about ways we might want to manage or mitigate or test for these contaminants. Who can tell me about some common contaminants?
Produce stickers.
Yeah, bane of our existence, produce stickers.
Plastic bags.
Plastic bags. Bio bags. White coffee cups, yeah, have a synthetic lining in them, so technically not compostable unless it says it's compostable, then maybe it's more compostable.
Styrofoam.
Yeah, styrofoam is trash, so not compostable. Shiny paper, yeah, has a lot of synthetic materials in the inks, so we don't want to use shiny papers. Other contaminants?
All the sprays in the house, clean this and that and the other.
Cleaning agents. That's interesting because a lot of those things do break down in the composting process, like pesticides and things, but some of them are persistent. So I guess it is better as a general rule to avoid putting synthetic chemicals into your compost pile, but it can break things down. Plastic, glass, and metal are not going to decompose. It's interesting because metal does rust and oxidize, but it doesn't really decompose necessarily. Styrofoam, produce stickers aren't going to decompose. It seems like we should have figured out how to make compostable produce stickers or something at this point. Maybe laser etch the barcode into the fruit peel or something. We also have chemical contaminants such as heavy metals. It depends on where you are. This is more thinking about kind of industrial scale. More polluted materials or polluted areas or polluted soils. Although we do have lead contaminated soils in our urban areas. It's also something to think about. There is a group of herbicides that can be persistent in compost, and I've mostly heard about this in industrial facilities. I haven't experienced it in any of our community compost piles. PFAS is a chemical agent that is used in bioplastics to help make it waterproof and oil-proof so that you can get your sandwich or burger to go and your bowl won't dissolve because of the heat and the sauce and the wetness of the food. And it's used everywhere. So it's not just in compostable foodware, it's also in our carpet, firefighting foam, our construction materials, our clothing, all sorts of things. It's in our industrial manufacturing process. And they use it because of that property where it's waterproof and grease-proof. So they like it for that purpose, and it's used everywhere. And it ends up in the landfill, leaches into the groundwater. It's highly mobile. It's resistant to degradation. It moves from environment to plant to animal very easily. And so we accumulate PFAS in our bodies very easily, and it contributes to long-term chronic health issues. So it's very problematic in that sense. And then it has recently gotten attention in compost because of all the compostable foodware. Basically anything made from molded fiber, like even egg cartons, are going to have PFAS in it to make it resistant to breakdown, basically. Some of the industry composters presented on PFAS and showed that PFAS is literally everywhere. It's in our food waste, it's in our wood chips, and it's in our compost piles. They didn't really have a good solution for it. For me, it speaks to our toxic industrial manufacturing process and how there's not a lot of good accountability there for environmental toxins. And so that accumulates and shows up in our waste management stream. And so waste management gets blamed for contaminants, but those are caused upstream, and it's more of a kind of a design and manufacturing issue. So yeah, PFAS is a major issue. A lot of community composters have said no compostable foodware, we're not taking any of it, because we don't know if it has PFAS or not, and then we don't want to be just composting bioplastics and compostable foodware all the time. That's not necessarily a great nutrient source for our soil microbiology. Ultimately, this is going to be loaded up on our soil. It's going to accumulate in our soil. And so we want to be thinking about, like, you know, is this material a beneficial substance for our soils and our food that's going to be grown out of it? Heavy metals are going to be hard. These are going to be the hardest things to deal with because they're an element. They don't break down any further. Most other pollutants are going to be able to be broken down by microbes or fungi or bacteria because they can be transformed into other substances. But because heavy metals are an element, they can't be broken down any further. They can only be made inactive by being sequestered into a larger complex where they're not available to cause damage, or they can be removed from the environment. And in which case, we have to think about, like, where should we put it if we're gonna remove it? Like this is where we could use more research, is like, where did this heavy metal even come from? Like, did we mine it? Like, should we put it back in the mine? So those are some deeper questions to think about, because a lot of remediation approaches just say, like, remove the heavy metals from phytoremediation and then put it in hazardous waste. And like, I don't even know what they do in hazardous waste to deal with that situation. So that, I feel like, is a space where we could use some more thought and research about, like, a more ecologically helpful way to deal with heavy metals. So these naturally occur from metal-bearing rocks and volcanic eruptions, but from human activities is from mining, industrial production, and industrial agriculture. Some research shows that mechanically separated waste is higher in heavy metals than source separated waste. So mechanically separated is like if you go to a waste transfer station, they have big machines that would just take all of your non-separated waste, and they have different screens and rotators to separate out your waste from your, like, recycling, from your food waste. And so that process has shown to be higher in heavy metals in the compost than if it's pre-separated from the generators. Aerobic composting does help to sequester heavy metals, so it limits their bioavailability, but those heavy metals are still present there. So there's some concern that, you know, if environmental pH conditions change, that those metals could become available and cause damage. So it's like not like maybe a final solution, but it's maybe like you can maybe feel safe for a moment with compost sequestering heavy metals and, like, limiting their bioavailability. So yeah, bioavailability versus being bound up in, like, complexes. So that makes them not available. The U.S. Compost Council has a compost quality testing program called the Seal of Testing Assurance. Designates testing limits based on the EPA for maximum concentrations of heavy metals in compost. And so they have that listed on their website, so I listed them here. So you can check out their website to see those limits. They have kind of an expensive, like, testing program for compost quality, but you kind of have to, I think you have to pay to, like, certify your compost as part of their STA program, and then your test results have to meet these heavy metal limits, and then they have to meet the pathogen assessment, so, you know, under threshold pathogen detection. But they don't specify, like, what ranges your compost needs to meet for, like, different lab testing indicators. So the main requirement is that you need to do a lab test for your compost to be certified, but you don't have to meet specific ranges for, like, the organic matter, bulk density, things like that. The only things you have to meet for your limits are the heavy metal limits and the pathogen limits. So it's really, they're really more focused on, like, you know, harm kind of minimization. This is a table that looks at some different thresholds for heavy metals based on the situation. The second column is the one that I usually reference. This is the human health screening level from the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And so it lists kind of threshold limits for different heavy metals over here in soil. And some of these other columns are for more kind of contaminated sites, so they have higher limits for that, so we don't want to look at those. So I reference this column usually. So this is supposed to be below the level of concern for human health. So those are the limits I reference. Like for lead, it's at 80 parts per million. Arsenic is at 0.07, so it's very low. So you want to make sure your arsenic levels are very low. So when we do the heavy metals testing on soils, I take those results and kind of compare it to the threshold levels listed here to see if like, oh, do we have too much lead or too much arsenic? Do we need to do like remediation or anything like that? So this is the column that I compare it to. So as I mentioned, most pesticides break down during composting. There's some hardcore ones that don't break down as much, like the organic chlorines, and then some of the like DDT. Like we don't use DDT anymore in developing countries, or developed countries. But some of the developing countries still use DDT, like in Southeast Asia. And they use a lot of it, and so just it's kind of still around in the atmosphere, and also our kind of history of using DDT, like there's still kind of residues that remain from that, and so that kind of stuff like is resistant to breakdown. There's also a group of herbicides, as I mentioned, that are persistent. They're called clopyrrolid, picloram, aminopyrrolid, and aminocyclopyrrochlor, and they were being produced by Dow. I think one of them, aminopyrrolid, the patent expired, so it's opening up to generic production by the market, and so the concern is that there's going to be less regulation around it. More people are going to be producing it. Less regulation, potentially more contamination. So what happens is, at some of these industrial facilities, this material is sprayed on like grass hay feed for like horses, so it kind of comes through horse manure, and I don't know what it is about the industrial process. One of the things I heard from one of these sites was that they were composting at really high temperatures, like 180, 190, and the herbicide was persistent in that process. So in the finished compost, backyard gardeners were buying it and using it, and it was causing all sorts of damage to their plants. Like stunted growth, leaf curling, misshapen fruits, yellowing, things like that. And this issue has showed up in some other industrial sites as well. And we use manure. I've used horse bedding in my composting. And so in the community scale compost projects, like I've never seen an issue with it. Other composters dilute kind of their feedstock. So feedstock diversity helps with this thing. So like maybe not using solely horse manure for their feedstock, but incorporating other types of manure, other types of feedstocks as well. What this company did when they were dealing with this issue was they added a high carbon wood ash to their compost, and that helped to sequester the persistent herbicides, and so they didn't see damage from it as much when they did that. They also took a break from taking in horse manure when they were dealing with this issue. But I think they still take it in now. They just incorporate it at kind of a lower rate. The leaves are all kind of have like bumps and misshapen areas on them. The fruits are misshapen. There's leaf curling, there's yellowing. So those are some of the signs and symptoms of herbicide damage. So if you see your finished compost doing that to your plants, then you'll know that it's like an herbicide contamination. So one of the ways that they deal with this in order to test for this is to do a bioassay. So similar to the compost quality bioassay, it's like a plant potting mix experiment. So they test their compost. In this plant potting mix experiment, they use specific seeds and plant types that are sensitive to the herbicide and can show damage very easily. So these herbicides are designed to be acting against broadleaf weeds, and so they're used on like roadsides and industrial sites, pastures and grazed areas. So one of the composters was saying, like, if you have herbicide contaminated compost, you could just apply it to turf grass and it'll just, basically you're using it as an herbicide. So that's another way of dealing with it, but sure. So there is like kind of specific bioassay protocols. Some of these folks have shared their bioassay protocols with me, so that's going to be part of like the manual and stuff. So if you do run across this issue, those are some of the techniques that people have used to deal with this. So I'm going to move on to bioplastics. So there's different types of bioplastic. Some of the definitions, like bio-based, doesn't mean it's like necessarily compostable. It just means there's some plant-based material in it, and usually means it's like actually plastic. There's just some plant-based material in it, so it makes it seem like it's more eco-friendly. Degradable means it breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, but that doesn't necessarily mean it gets metabolized or mineralized by the microbial ecology. So it could be just tiny pieces of plastic that are just accumulating, like microplastics essentially. You can't see it, so it seems like it went away, but it's still like causing effects in the environment. Biodegradable means it gets broken down, it gets mineralized and metabolized by the microbial ecology, but there's no telling how long that process is going to take. So just because it's biodegradable doesn't mean it's going to decompose in like 6 months. It could take like, years still for it to decompose. So the most kind of trustworthy label and definition is compostable. So that's where it actually gets mineralized, metabolized, decomposed in a hot compost process. So within like 3 to 6 months, it's gonna fully decompose. But even then, it's like the definition is like 60 to 90% full like metabolism and mineralization. So it's not 100% necessarily. So there's still some percentage that's like not fully decomposed. So bioplastics are produced from a lot of different things, from vegetable fats and oils, oftentimes from high starch plants like corn, sugarcane, or beets. And those are modified in order to make things like PLA, polylactic acid. And then also lignocellulose materials like straw, wood chips, or sawdust. There's some technologies that utilize recycled food waste as well as microorganisms to produce bioplastics. But I think still some of the most common materials are still the corn, sugarcane, and beets. There are also compostable foodware made out of palm leaf. Like those bowls I used for the soil demo were made out of palm leaf. And so those are fully decomposable. There's no PFAS in them because they're not molded fiber. Bamboo and wood products are also going to be free from PFAS. Those are some of your safest like compostable foodware products is palm leaf, bamboo, wood, and actually polylactic acid. If it's just like pure PLA, it's like more likely to be PFAS free. It's your molded fiber paper pulp products that are going to have PFAS in them. I mentioned the fate is what's important about bioplastic. So it can break down into smaller pieces, but what we want is like full mineralization and metabolism by the microbial community. So full decomposition means it gets transformed into carbon dioxide, I guess potentially methane if it's undergoing anaerobic process, but water, inorganic compounds, or other biomass. So secondary metabolites. Basically, you want CO2, water, and secondary metabolites from the full decomposition process. What's actually compostable and what will actually decompose in your compost pile is kind of a subset of what's biodegradable. So I just wanted to kind of distinguish between those two definitions. Just because it's biodegradable doesn't mean it'll compost in your compost pile. So this is kind of defined by the American Society for Testing and Materials, who creates definitions for a lot of these bioplastic materials. So yeah, they assess the biodegradability and total mineralization of these materials. So as I mentioned, 60% or higher mineralization certifies that it's biodegradable. So it's not even 100% or close to that. So you can still have like 40% that's not mineralized and it's technically biodegradable. So this is just kind of a map of how they do their definitions and testing. If it's biodegradable, then it's not necessarily compostable. It has additionally to pass some toxicity tests in order to be classified as compostable. This is a look at PLA bottles decomposing in compost facility. Generally, if you don't have a pile full of PLA bottles, if it's just like a few, then they will disappear and decompose. There may still be some percentage that has not fully mineralized, but has broken down into small enough particles that you can't see them. One of the issues that's raised by composters is, if you're making, like for industrial composters, if they're composting all of these bioplastics all the time, like what's the kind of, and then you're applying that compost to the soil, like how much microplastics are you loading up into your soil over time? And what's the effect on the soil microbiology? So those are like questions that there's not a lot of information on right now. But I think those are like the important questions to be asking. Like, what's the effect of accumulating microplastics in the soil? PLA will disappear in the compost pile, but is it still, how is it still affecting the microbial ecology? Because some percentage of it is still gonna be there probably. So you might wanna be thinking about a lot of more stringent composters, and a lot of community composters are going to say no to all compostable foodware and no to all bioplastics because it could potentially overload the system and generate and contribute to contamination in the soil. And it's hard to distinguish sometimes between these different types of plastics, so it's easier to introduce contamination if you're going to accept these materials. So this is kind of a tricky question. People think that compostable foodware is amazing, can keep supporting convenience and still be good for the environment, but it's still really tricky and challenging for composters to deal with these materials. So there's an organization called the Biodegradable Products Institute that certifies products as compostable. And so they have to meet those ASTM standards for compostability, which is not 100%, in order to be defined as compostable. So they had a long list of bioplastics products, and then this whole PFAS thing came up, and they had to make their standards more stringent, so they got rid of a lot of materials in their certified database. So they have really, reduced the number of products in their database that are less high in PFAS or not detecting PFAS. Okay, so this is about PFAS, which stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. As I mentioned, it's found in food packaging, all of these commercial household products. Oh yeah, it's also in our non-stick products, Teflon, water repellent fabrics, polishes, waxes, paints, cleaning products, our building construction, and so it's, as I mentioned, highly mobile, contaminates our groundwater, gets into animals and plants very easily. That's like a compostable plate from World Centric, which is molded fiber and tested high in PFAS. So this is a little bit of a look at, how PFAS moves around. So we're in our PFAS production industry. It goes into the groundwater, wastewater discharge, wastewater treatment plants, where it can leak into watersheds. Also in our landfills, where the leachate leads into the groundwater. Biosolids come from our wastewater and get applied to the soil, and it moves around in the ecology, as I mentioned, in plants and animals and stuff too. So it's kind of all around. These are some of the products that contain PFAS. So our molded fiber bowls, takeout and soup containers, molded fiber plates, molded fiber clamshells, some of these food trays, deli cups, pizza boxes, even these brown wrappers. So there was a big article out where people tested the compostable foodware bowls from Chipotle and Sweetgreen and found them high in PFAS. And so the article was kind of about, we thought we were doing something good by making compostable foodware for everyone, and it's actually high in this terrible contaminant that leaks into all of our environmental systems and causes long-term health issues. And that was caused to kind of a big disruption in the compost community. It's not really a great way of dealing with it other than, rejecting these materials basically. So basically they detect PFAS by testing for fluorine content. So if it's high in fluorine, then that means it is high in PFAS. If it's low in fluorine, then it doesn't have PFAS, and that's not a contamination issue. So it is the bamboo and kind of regular paper or paperboard, the clear PLA and paper-lined PLA, palm leaf. Some of the paper with unknown coatings is like the kind of conventional brands of paper plates, like Dixie and stuff. Like those are actually no PFAS in them. So like uncoated paper has like no PFAS in it. But yeah, if it has that synthetic like kind of plasticky coating, then that's probably a sign of PFAS. The products that consistently tested as fluorinated were all molded fiber products like wheat fiber or wheat stalk. If it says a blend of plant fibers, that's probably PFAS. There's a silvergrass, sugarcane waste, molded recycled paper, and some of the PLA-lined sugarcane. So I think it's more of the sugarcane that is getting mixed in with the PFAS. So if you want to look at more resources on PFAS, you can go to the Center for Environmental Health, the CEH website. They have a lot of resources on PFAS, and this is where that information came from. They tested like all these different products. At the time, they had kind of an open testing like invitation, so you could send in your products for testing for PFAS, and they generated a big public database for that. And so they recommend reusables, like just do your dishes, instead of trying to be using convenient like food packaging all the time. So these are some links to those resources. They have their public database listed there on the Google spreadsheet doc. So that's where you can look up all these different brands and products to see how they tested on PFAS. PFAS procurement guide from another organization called Clean Production, which is also kind of a buyer's guide to more safe foodware products. So what to do? A lot of people are just like, we don't accept compostable serviceware. And honestly, it makes sense for a lot of community compost sites because it's like you don't have a lot of capacity to begin with usually. And so you don't want to be overwhelmed with compostable products that are like questionable in terms of how beneficial they are to your compost quality and your soil health. You can probably handle a little bit if you're doing some really good hot composting, but you don't want to say that because like people are just going to throw that stuff at you. Like even if you say, I don't accept any of this stuff, you're going to see some of this stuff because like people are not perfect in understanding what materials go in the compost and what don't. So I'm going to open it up to you guys. Like, how do you think are good ways to respond to contaminants in the compost pile? How do you want to deal with bioplastics?
Reduce at source. Use a lot less. Oh, you're seriously asking this question.
Yeah, we are seriously discussing.
Reduce at source.
Reduce that source.
Absolutely. You're the consumer. You buy less of this stuff, they'll make less of this stuff. That's it.
Yeah, definitely a whole systems design issue. Oops. Sorry.
I think even just having a bin separate from it that people could just toss it in there if they're going to bring it anyways, and then you could just deal with it and it would just be in one bin.
How would you deal with it?
I do not know that part yet.
Maybe make a separate bioplastics pile?
Oh, yeah, I guess.
Or art sculpture, that's a good way to deal with things.
Yeah, I think there's power in like our exercising our political voice and like our political power and putting pressure on like big companies to stop producing these things, as well as like individual changes in our lives, because us as individuals are only responsible for so much, and a lot of these big industries and like global industries are causing a lot of these issues, and exercising our political voice is a really important part of like this process too.
Definitely. More advocacy hopefully will be helpful.
I'm thinking that maybe we can use them to pot our plants, since we already buy plastic to like then pot our plants. So maybe we can collect them and then just reuse them to pot new plants and then give them back to people.
That's definitely a possibility. Who?
So like I was just reading on my phone about it, like because I noticed on the cups that it says industrially compostable, and pretty much the reason is that they take that plastic and they put it to heat, and then after that the enzymes are able to break it down a little bit faster. So I don't know if there's like a DIY method of incinerating it before you put it in the compost, and that's the only thing I could think about.
Yeah, and now that you guys know how to do hot composting, all of you guys are going to get your compost piles to temperature, and you probably still don't want to overload it with bioplastics. The other thing that a lot of industrial composters do is screen things out at the end. So like if it's like a municipal composter, generally they deal with a lot of waste, and so they get a lot of contamination coming in to their systems. And the way they deal with that is they screen it out at the end. And I've seen some of these, and it's like there's as much trash being screened out as there is compost being made. So anyway, it's like we want to prevent that trash from going in the first place. That's really the ideal situation. And so that's a lot of education to the people who are generating and dropping off food scraps about how to properly separate their materials.
So I've read up a lot about like Paul Stamets' experiments on like how he uses oyster mushrooms to clean up the oil spills, and plastics in general are made of oil, which are hydrocarbons. And so I've also seen other folks who like break down plastics like as fine as they can and try to train the mycelium to break down the small increments over time. Like they add a little bit at a time so that it gets used to using it as a food source. But their enzymes are able to like break it down further as well. And when y'all brought up the Roundup thing, that reminded me too, like the main ingredient for Roundup is glyphosate, which is a high phosphate element. And like when it comes to bioremediation, like if you can identify the elements that are within the soil, there's like lists being made or like studies being made for those specific elements. For example, like Mundo Gardens, our Joe's Pocket Farm where Janice Reynoso works at. I don't know where she's at, but when they did the soil test for that space, they found a bunch of PCBs, which polychloric biphenyls, which is just compounds that have a lot of chlorine in it. And so like once you find like that essential ingredient that's causing the harm to the land, you can create a plan around it. And I feel like it's better to do it within a contained environment so you're not like cross-contaminating, or like you're able to like follow specifically what's going on in the pile you're using. Yeah.
Thank you. Other thoughts? It's for the videographer.
Yeah, the term that comes to mind is just like to have more conversations around greenwashing. And then also just to like, instead of when people ask questions about like, oh, bioplastics and using compostable ware, like pointing them in a direction towards like banana leaf plates or like things that are already more closely and naturally connected to our environment instead of trying to take something that's been like created in a lab and forcing our earth to absorb it. That's my...
Thank you. Yeah, I recommend people, if they really want to use compostable foodware, to use like palm leaf or bamboo or wood-based products. So, yeah.
Nice, right?
Artistic. I would like to say something.
All right.
I guess all these points, we basically come back to being a community and educating each other. Having a big printout in front of our community composting center, and having a little handouts where, like, if somebody tells me, you know, if I'm doing 2 jobs and I have 3 kids, if somebody tells me, oh, this is not compostable, this is biodegradable, I don't remember it by the time I go home. If there is a handout that people, whoever come to our site, to the farmers market, they can take it and put it in front of on their refrigerator. That way kids also get used to it, you know, when they're going to McDonald's, kids can tell, Mama, I don't want that because that's not recyclable. So that way we can do more education wise as well. So having those things, and still don't use like, you know, laminating them or anything, just print it out on a paper, that's fine. Anybody want to?
All right. Thanks, guys, for your discussion.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.